Sometime in the 1950s, Jack O'Connor sat in a canvas camp on a Yukon mountainside and watched a dull sheep stand against the skyline at a distance that most hunters of the era would have declined to attempt. He had been in camps like this one many times. He had been looking at sheep like this one since before most of the men reading his column in Outdoor Life had taken their first deer. He settled behind his rifle, which was chambered in .270 Winchester, and made a calculation that he had made enough times to trust without hesitation. The shot was long, the cartridge was flat. He fired. The sheep didn't require a second round. O'Connor wrote about that shot, or one very much like it, in the pages of Outdoor Life. And then he wrote about it again in a slightly different form. And then he wrote about the .270 Winchester in general, explaining to the readers of the most widely circulated outdoor magazine in America why the cartridge he had chosen was the correct choice for the kind of hunting that required a rifle to reach across distance and still arrive with enough energy to finish the matter cleanly. He had been making that argument in print for going on 2 decades by the time he sat on that Yukon mountainside, and he would continue making it for 2 more decades after he came back down. By the time he stopped, the .270 Winchester was one of the most popular hunting cartridges in the United States. That had not been the forecast when Winchester introduced it 30 years before. This is the story of a cartridge that entered the American market in 1925 with modest credentials, generated weak sales through its first decade, came close enough to commercial extinction that Winchester's own management debated whether to discontinue it, and survived entirely because one man in Arizona with a typewriter and a column in a national magazine decided it was the right tool and would not stop saying so. The .270 Winchester is today chambered in more production bolt-action rifles than almost any other cartridge on the American market. The man who made that happen died in January of 1978. No one sent him a commission check. Winchester introduced the .270 in 1925, chambered in the Model 54 bolt action. The cartridge was a straightforward engineering decision. Winchester took the .30-06 Springfield case, which had been the U.S. military standard since 1906 and was already well established as a commercial hunting round, and neck it down to accept bullets of 277 thousandths of an inch in diameter. The resulting case held enough powder to drive those smaller, lighter bullets at velocities the .30-06 could not match with comparable bullet weights. A 130-grain .270 bullet left the muzzle at approximately 3,100 feet per second from a 24-inch barrel, depending on the specific load. A 150-grain .30-06 bullet left at roughly 2,900 feet per second. The .270 was moving faster, shooting flatter, and arriving at distance with a trajectory advantage that mattered on the open country of the American West, where ranges stretched to 250 yards and beyond as a routine matter rather than an exceptional one. On paper, the cartridge made sense. In the gun shops and sporting goods stores of the late 1920s and early 1930s, it did not immediately translate into sales that justified its place in the Winchester catalogue. The American hunting public of that era was accustomed to cartridges built around heavier, larger bore bullets. The .30-06 was established and trusted. The .30-30 Winchester was deeply entrenched among deer hunters in the eastern and midwestern timber country, where ranges were short, and the flat shooting advantage of the .270 meant nothing at 60 yards through hardwood brush. The large-bore faction of the gun press, anchored most visibly by the writer and cartridge developer Elmer Keith of Salmon, Idaho, was actively skeptical of light, fast cartridges as a general proposition. Keith's position was that a bullet needed to be heavy and wide to anchor game cleanly and reliably. That velocity was a secondary consideration to mass and sectional density, and that the .270's 130-grain bullet lacked the weight to handle the largest North American animals with the margin that a serious hunter required when a wounded animal might disappear into rough country. Keith made this argument in print with the conviction and the specific detail of a man who had used large-bore cartridges on large animals in unforgiving terrain and had formed his views from outcomes rather than from theory. The Depression accelerated the 270's commercial difficulties. Winchester's management, looking at sales figures against catalogue maintenance costs in a period when the entire firearms and ammunition market had contracted sharply, had a rational case for clearing low-performing cartridges from the lineup. Tooling cost money to maintain. Shelf space at distributors cost money to hold. A cartridge that had not found its audience in its first decade of commercial availability was a candidate for quiet removal from the catalogue, and the 270 Winchester had not, in its first 10 years, found an audience large enough to make the argument for its continued existence self-evident. There was no groundswell of demand from retailers. There was no organized community of hunters writing to Winchester to express what the cartridge meant to them. There was a cartridge that had been introduced on a reasonable engineering premise and had not caught fire with the buying public, in a market that was contracting and forcing decisions about what to keep and what to let go. By the best available accounts from that period, including references in O'Connor's own later writing, the 270 was genuinely close to the end of its commercial life before it had found its voice. Jack O'Connor was born in Nogales, Arizona, in 1902, and grew up hunting the desert and mountain country of the American Southwest in conditions that selected very precisely for what a hunting rifle needed to do. The game he pursued as a young man was not pursued in hardwood timber at close range in the rain. It was pursued in open country where the distance between the hunter and the animal was frequently measured in hundreds of yards, where the elevation changes of the desert mountains could put a hunter above the game or below it at angles that required a judgment about bullet drop that a shooter in eastern timber never needed to develop, and where a flat-shooting rifle gave options that a slower, heavier cartridge did not. He had also developed, from that specific experience, a particular view about recoil and what it did to a hunter's shooting over the course of a season. A man who spent 2 weeks carrying a rifle in rough country and firing it under field conditions that were nothing like the bench was a man whose relationship with recoil was not theoretical. O'Connor had observed that hunters who were shooting heavy recoiling cartridges developed flinches that cost them animals, and that the same hunters shooting a milder cartridge with comparable terminal performance at field ranges shot better, recovered faster between shots, and came home with more consistent results. This was not a point that showed up well in a ballistics table. It showed up in the field, in the difference between hunters who placed their first shot and hunters who did not. He joined Outdoor Life as shooting editor in 1939. The magazine's circulation made it one of the most widely read outdoor publications in the country, and the shooting editor column reached hunters who were actively making decisions about rifles and cartridges. O'Connor used that platform the way a skilled advocate uses a courtroom. He proceeded methodically, repeatedly, with accumulating evidence and a willingness to engage the opposing argument directly rather than ignore it. He explained the ballistics in terms that a reader without an engineering background could follow and test in the field. He described specific hunts with the particularity of a man who had kept notes on everyone: the distance, the angle, the animal's reaction, the number of rounds fired. He addressed Keith's large-bore arguments point by point, acknowledging where a heavier bullet had a real advantage and contending that the conditions producing that advantage were not the conditions most of his readers would encounter in their actual hunting lives. What made O'Connor's advocacy effective over the long term was not enthusiasm. Any writer can sustain enthusiasm for a season. What O'Connor sustained for 33 years at Outdoor Life, and for years before and after, was a consistent, detailed, empirical argument that didn't require the reader to take anything on faith. He wrote about the same cartridge for 4 decades without repeating himself, because the situations that revealed what the cartridge could do were genuinely varied, and because he kept going into the field in new country against new game and coming back with results that refreshed the argument. A reader who had been following his column for 10 years had by that point accumulated a documentary record of the .270 Winchester's performance across a range of conditions that no single shooting test or ballistics chart could replicate. The evidence was longitudinal. It was the kind of evidence that changes minds not in a single column, but across years of consistent results from a man who had no commercial reason to produce a result that contradicted what the data showed. The O'Connor and Keith rivalry became one of the defining debates in 20th century American gun writing, and it was a genuine debate between 2 men who knew the subject and had done the hunting, not a promotional dispute between paid advocates. Keith was not wrong that a .338 or a .375 handled a brown bear or a Cape buffalo with a margin the .270 could not match. The physics of a heavier, wider bullet at adequate velocity, producing deeper penetration and larger wound channels in the heaviest and most dangerous game, were not in dispute, and O'Connor didn't dispute them. His counter was more precise than a simple disagreement. He was arguing that the specific game Keith's cartridge preferences were optimized for was not the game that defined the hunting life of the men reading either column. The average reader of Outdoor Life in 1945 was hunting white-tailed deer in the Midwest, or mule deer in the West, or elk in the Northern Rockies. He was not hunting brown bear in Alaska or dangerous game in Africa. Optimizing a cartridge recommendation for the heaviest animal a man might theoretically encounter, rather than for the animals he was actually hunting in the country he actually lived in and could afford to reach, was in O'Connor's view a form of advice that was technically defensible but practically unhelpful to the specific hunter receiving it. That is a harder argument to dismiss than a simple performance comparison, and Keith never fully refuted it because it was grounded in an accurate reading of the readership they were both addressing. What the readers of Outdoor Life did across 33 years of O'Connor's tenure was buy .270 Winchester rifles, not because he told them to and they complied without thinking, but because the case he made was specific enough and grounded enough in verifiable hunting experience that the men who went out and used the cartridge came back with results that confirmed what he had described. The .270 shot flat. It was accurate in a way that rewarded the shooter who took the time to work up a good load and find his rifle's preference in bullet weight. The recoil was manageable enough that a hunter could maintain his cheek weld through the shot and make a follow-up if one was needed without having built a flinch into his shooting from the first round. At the ranges that Western hunting produced, from mule deer in the sagebrush to pronghorn on the high flats, to elk on the timber edges where a 300-yard shot was a reasonable, rather than an exceptional thing to attempt, it performed with a consistency that word of mouth reinforced on top of what the magazine was saying. Winchester never discontinued the .270. The depression passed. The sales recovered as the cartridge found the audience that O'Connor was writing to and for. By the post-war years, the .270 Winchester was a catalogue staple that no manufacturer with a complete bolt-action line could reasonably omit. The argument for its presence in the catalogue had shifted from O'Connor making the case to the sales figures making the case, and the sales figures were now unambiguous. Remington chambered the Model 700 in it when that rifle was introduced in 1962. Ruger chambered the Model 77 in it. Weatherby built rifles around it. Savage offered it. The cartridge that had been under genuine commercial threat in the 1930s was by the 1960s one of the defining chamberings of the American bolt-action market, present in every price range from entry-level to custom. O'Connor retired from Outdoor Life in 1972. He kept writing, He had books in progress and hunting accounts to finish and opinions to deliver on the cartridge debates that continued in his absence from the magazine. He died in January of 1978 in Lewiston, Idaho, where he had moved after leaving outdoor life. He had been making the case for the .270 Winchester for approximately 40 years by that point, and the cartridge he had adopted in the 1930s on the basis of his own hunting experience in the desert country of Arizona was, at the time of his death, one of the most widely sold sporting cartridges in the United States. The .270 Winchester today occupies a position in the American hunting rifle market that its early commercial history gave no reason to expect. It is offered as a standard chambering in virtually every bolt-action rifle line produced in the United States. The factory ammunition selection spans bullet weights from 90 grains for varmints to 150 grains for elk, with the 130 and 140 grain loads that O'Connor favored remaining the most popular options by sales volume. The cartridge's case, which is the .30-06 case necked down to 277 thousandths, has proven dimensionally stable and well-suited to the full range of modern propellants, which means the hand-loading potential that O'Connor explored in his own loading work remains as accessible to the contemporary shooter as it was to the readers he was writing for in 1950. The argument O'Connor made for 40 years turned out to be correct in the terms he specified. Not correct for every hunter in every condition, which is not what he claimed, but correct for most hunters pursuing most North American game in the open country, where flat trajectory produced a real and measurable advantage over slower cartridges, and correct in its assessment that manageable recoil produced better field shooting than theoretical terminal performance advantages from cartridges that the average hunter flinched away from when the moment came. The precision of that argument is what made it durable. It was not a claim that the .270 was the best cartridge ever made. It was a claim about the relationship between what most hunters actually needed and what the .270 actually delivered. And that relationship remained stable across the 40 years he was describing it, because neither the hunters nor the cartridge changed in ways that made the description less accurate. Elmer Keith outlived O'Connor by several years and never conceded the argument. He did not need to. Both men had been right about what they knew firsthand, grounded in specific experience with specific animals in specific country, and both had been accurate in their claims as far as those claims extended. The argument between them was never really about whether a heavier bullet hit harder or whether a faster bullet shot flatter. Both of those things are true. The argument was about which truth mattered more to the man with a rifle in his hands who was going to be 250 yards from a mule deer at first light and needed to make a decision he had already made months before at the gun counter. O'Connor's answer to that question, repeated across 4 decades in the pages of a magazine that reached millions of households, was the .270 Winchester. The market's answer, repeated across decades of sales data, confirmed that he had read the question correctly. The .270 Winchester today is chambered in more production bolt-action rifles than almost any other cartridge in the American market. The factory ammunition selection spans bullet weights from 90 grains for varmint applications to 150 grains for elk-sized game, with the 130 and 140 grain loads that O'Connor favored remaining the most popular choices by sales volume. The cartridge's case, which is the .30-06 case necked to 277 thousandths, has proven dimensionally stable and well-suited to the full range of modern propellants developed in the decades since O'Connor was loading it on his own bench. The hand-loading potential he explored is as accessible to the contemporary shooter as it was to the readers he was writing for in 1952. Somewhere in this country this morning, a man is pulling a .270 Winchester bolt action from the case he has had it in since last season and running a patch through the bore before heading out. He did not read Jack O'Connor. He may not know the name. He knows the cartridge shoots flat and comes back with results he needs, which is what O'Connor said about it in 1942 and in 1955 and in 1968 and in every year between and after those years until he had no more years to say it. The argument is still being made. It is being made by the cartridge itself, one season at a time, in the hands of men who never knew the name of the writer who kept it alive long enough for them to find it.